Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe. Also, I thank you for helping Midnight Broadcast reach 5,000 subscribers. The special broadcast for this milestone will be released on Friday.
This took place back home on my reservation. I'm Algonquin First Nation from Canada. On the res, traditional beliefs and legends of the paranormal are still a big part of our community. The paranormal is a regular part of life. We believe in a spirit world, and we believe that sometimes these beings can cross over into our world, and maybe even live amongst us. Anyways, here's the story. It was the fall of 2011. I was 16 years old and living in a city near the reservation with my mom. Every weekend we'd go back home to the res to see my dad and my little brother. One Friday, during the drive back home, I got a text from a friend of mine. There was a party that night and she wanted to know when I'd be home so she could come pick me up. I gave her a time and she told me she'd swing by. My mom and I get home, and as soon as we step inside the house, we see my dad and my cousin sitting at the kitchen table drinking some beers. They are both cops on the res, and beers on a Friday evening means that they had a particularly tough week at work. Typically, the toughest cases to deal with are child abuse and molestation, so a part of me feels sad upon seeing them. They both look tired and drained, but they're happy to see us. We say our greetings, catch up a little, and my dad asks me if I have any plans. I mention the party and tell him where it'll be. He and my cousin share a weird look. I don't know, should we tell her? My cousin said, looking at my dad. He laughed, and they decided that I should probably know what's been going on since I'd be going to a house pretty deep in the woods later that evening. They start with the first strange call they got on Monday night. An older woman called saying that people were outside of her house knocking on all of her windows. She said she couldn't see anybody, but there must have been at least 3 people, judging by all the different locations of the knocking. They arrive at the woman's home, inspect all around the house, even check the woods, but nothing comes up. They tell her that it's probably just some teenagers playing tricks on her and that there isn't much else they can do besides patrol around the area in case they come back. On Wednesday night, the same woman called again with the same problem. She said people were knocking on all her windows. It had rained that day and there was mud all around this woman's home, so they figure that at the very least, they'd find footprints, but they couldn't find a thing. This is when they started feeling like something was off, because there were huge patches of mud everywhere. They thought maybe the woman was lying, but they just told her the same thing they told her a few nights prior. By Thursday night, everyone on the res was talking. It turns out, this woman wasn't the only one experiencing the knocking. She was just the only one to call the police. People were linking it to supernatural causes, but my dad was still sure it was just a group of teens pranking people. But then they got another call from the same woman for the same reason. They rushed over and were met with the same situation, except this time, the woman's neighbor walked over looking pale as a ghost. "Is this about the knocking?" he asked, looking very shaky. "Yeah, did you see something?" The man nodded and said, "You guys are going to think I'm crazy." He goes on to explain that he'd stepped outside for a cigarette on his front porch when he heard knocking. He looked around and saw something by the old woman's house. There was a black figure standing outside her window looking into her home. He said it looked like a person, completely made out of shadow, but he could tell it was solid. He couldn't make out any features on it. He stared at it, completely in shock, and watched the thing as it knocked a couple of times and then darted around the house knocking on every single window. He said it moved too fast to be human. It was practically a blur. It went around the house a few times, then it ran across the road into the tree line, behind one tree in particular, as though it were hiding. The man was frozen, but he couldn't look away. The black shadow then leaned out from behind the tree, staring directly at him with yellow eyes that reflected light like a cat's, and then it smiled, showing many small, pointed teeth. I almost shit my pants. He tried to joke, but his voice was still shaking. My dad didn't know what to make of this, But after checking on the old woman and finding her okay, although shaken, he told them that he'd keep an eye on things and to just put it out of their minds. Fast forward to Friday. By this point, everyone's got their own story. In addition to numerous people experiencing the knocking, there were also quite a few more sightings, and everyone described the thing exactly the same to my dad. One woman was taking her trash bin out to the road when she thought she saw someone in her peripheral vision standing near the trees. As she walked back up the driveway to her home, she felt like she was being watched. Right before she was about to open her door to go back inside her home, she looked back and saw two reflective yellow eyes watching her from the trees. She said they were about 5 feet off the ground. Another couple was driving at night and they saw a humanoid figure standing in the middle of the road. As they got closer, they slowed down, and it turned around to face them. They saw the figure had reflective yellow eyes and the sharp, pointed teeth as it smiled at them. They stopped the car, too afraid to get any closer to it, until they decided to just speed past it. It was a narrow road and the figure was only a few feet away as they drove by it. They said it was staring at them the whole time. "You sure you still want to go to that party?" my dad asked. But my friends were already pulling into the driveway, so I gave my family hugs and kisses and said goodbye. They told me to be careful. I wasn't too concerned though. A common belief among native people is that negative energy attracts negative energy, so an evil spirit will be drawn to people with unresolved issues or traumas. But if you're someone who is spiritual, self-aware, and basically a good person, that, in and of itself, will be protective. I get to the party and within 20 minutes, the conversation shifts towards all the paranormal experiences people have been having. I'm really curious about what everyone has to say, because they have stories that I hadn't heard yet. But my friend couldn't hold her alcohol very well. We were 16, after all, and she was crying, and I was trying to make her feel better while listening to everyone's stories. One of the people at the party was related to the smoking man that my father first talked to, the one who first described the shadow thing that darted into the trees. This person told us that the experience shook the smoking man up and he had smudged his entire home. Smudging is something our people do when we're looking for extra protection against paranormal entities. The man also went to visit multiple elders around the community, asking for advice or if they knew what was going on. It's commonly on the res that paranormal experiences don't happen as often as they used to. If you talk to the elders, they have endless stories, and even more advice about how to protect yourself compared to younger generations. Anyway, the man had gone to visit some elders, and one of them had explained that the shadow thing was evidence that someone was doing an unauthorized shaking tent ceremony. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up. But it's basically, and I'm generalizing, like a Ouija board session that takes place inside a tent. People stand around the tent, while the shaman goes inside and asks questions. The tent begins to shake, and you can hear the voices of spirits coming through. I've never personally been to a shaking tent ceremony because we haven't had a good enough reason to make one. Typically, our ancestors used them when they were starving in the dead of winter and needed to know where the nearest food source was. My mom's been to one, and her story is absolutely crazy. She described multiple voices, men and women, all speaking the native tongue. She said they were very upset that the people were doing a shaking tent ceremony since they weren't yet on the verge of death. The people tried to explain that we're only doing the ceremony to prove that it was real. This was at a time when our people felt like we were losing our culture as a result of residential schools. But the explanations didn't help. The spirits were angry about this, saying that the bridge between the two worlds should never be opened unless absolutely necessary, because you don't know who you're communicating with. It could be good spirits, or it could be evil ones. It might be ancestors, but you never know. Anyways, back to the smoking man. The elders told him that the shadow thing with yellow eyes that everyone was hearing and seeing was a spirit. It crossed over into our world because of a shaking tent ceremony. Someone on the reserve had been doing them without the consultation of the elders, they said. At this point, two of the drunkest dudes at the party started saying disrespectful things about the shadow entity, trying to act macho. Most of us were looking at each other like, why would you disrespect an evil spirit? That's exactly how you attract it to you. That's when I went back to the sunroom to console my drunk, crying friend. But while I was with her, I noticed that the rocking chair outside on the porch was rocking back and forth by itself. I looked away immediately, refusing to make direct eye contact, but I could see it moving in my peripheral vision. We're raised in our culture to ignore paranormal experiences. Spirits feed on the energy that people put towards them, so if you freak out, get angry, yell at it, start crying, or anything like that, it will stick around once. That's what it wants. It thrives on energy of any kind. 5 minutes or so go by, and I'm still seeing the rocking chair move out of the corner of my eye. Suddenly I hear a commotion. One of the other girls claims to have seen the spirit. We later nicknamed it Kokogi, an Algonquin word for monster. She said she was listening to the boys talk about the spirit, when she saw one of the boys staring very strangely out onto the balcony behind her. She turned around to see what he was looking at, and through the window was the shadow spirit sitting on the rocking chair, literally 3 feet away from her, smiling. The boy who had been staring out there sprinted towards the balcony doors, slammed them open, and charged at the spirit. I went outside to check on this boy and found him staring into the woods. He turned back to look at me and said, "Get everyone inside." The tone of his voice made me automatically obey. He came back inside and told everyone to clean up the place so that we could leave, and we spent a while just cleaning. We heard knocking coming from all around the house the entire time. Finally, we prepared to leave. People piled into their cars and began to take off. Me and the boy were walking towards his truck. He was going to drive me home, when suddenly he began to rush me and pushed me into the truck. He jumped into and peeled out of there. I asked him why he did that, but he refused to talk about it. A few days later, I ended up hanging out with him and he told me his experience of that night. While the other boys were disrespecting the spirit, he saw it appear out of thin air on the rocking chair out in the balcony. He made eye contact with it and couldn't look away. He and the spirits were staring each other down, and that's when one of the girls saw his expression. She turned around, saw the spirit, and immediately screamed. He said it was instinct to defend his friends, and that's why he ran outside and charged it. He said that the feeling he was getting from the Kokogi was almost like he was daring him to do something. But the second he got up, the Kokogi stood up and ran into the woods, disappearing from the patio in a blur. When the boy outside, he stood on the lawn and saw it standing at the tree line, looking right at him with a smile on its face. Later, as we walked to the truck, he saw it again, and that's why he had pushed me into his truck. After he dropped us all off at our houses, he and his friend realized that they never locked the door to the cottage, so they went back. But his friend was too scared to go in, even though it was his cottage, so the boy went in by himself. The second he opened the door, he saw the thing standing inside the living room. The boy locked the door as fast as he could and hopped back in the truck. The two peeled out of the driveway. Sightings continued for a few days after that. It was the talk of the res, but eventually everything just stopped. No more knocking, no more sightings. Everyone was curious about what happened to Spirit. What exactly was it? And would it come back? Eventually, word came down to us from up north where sightings of the same spirit were seen in a different community. White people in the town just north of us were reporting strange sightings, and other reservations near us were as well. The way the stories were coming in, it was like the spirit was traveling north. Anyways, it's 2018 now and no one else on my res has had any sighting of this particular thing.
California seems mainly to have alien stories. I do have two from that general area. I believe one is from the San Bernardino Mountains, and it's sort of a UFO story but not your average fare. The other is a transcript from the 50s of man who claimed encounter an unusual man in the mountains, I believe near Sequoia. I recently received a telephone call from an experiencer who is a medical professional living in Palm Springs, California. I'll refer to him as Mike. This specific incident occurred in the winter of 1999 when Mike, his brother, and two other friends were young men living in southeast Los Angeles. One afternoon, they were hanging out at one of their homes, when they all experienced a sensation of urgency. Each man described the same feeling that they must get to a certain location ASAP. They somehow knew where they needed to go, but had no idea what they would find there. Their urge to get to the mysterious location was so intense that they actually stole a relative's van. The group drove northeast towards the San Bernardino Mountains, an area that none of the young men was familiar with. Mike stated that he had no recollection of the trip, aside from feeling that they were heading in the right direction. Suddenly, the entire group screamed in unison, "Stop!" They found themselves on a gravel road, and they quickly piled out of the vehicle. By this time, it was totally dark, but they all knew in what direction they needed to walk. Mike said that they were walking through an area with large pine trees, and it was much cooler than the city, but no one was complaining. They hiked for about 45 minutes, until they all felt that they had reached their destination. In a small clearing, a black rock was found that was shaped like a perfect cube. Mike thinks it was about 5 feet square and all of the young men could see it without a flashlight. They scampered onto the top of the monolith and collapsed into a deep sleep. Then suddenly, they all woke to the sound of something heading in their direction. There were hundreds of white orbs of various sizes darting through the trees around them. They were making very unusual sounds which scared Mike and his friends. They immediately jumped off the rock and began to run in the direction of van, but the orbs chased them through the forest the entire way, buzzing all around them. They knew that they were getting close to the van, when the orbs suddenly disappeared. Within seconds, they were abruptly confronted by several large dark-colored vehicles with bright searchlights. Mike said that he doesn't know how or from where the vehicles suddenly appeared. They seemed to emerge from out of nowhere. A loud human voice yelled, "What the hell are you doing here?" Mike said that none of them responded to the voice. They were too confused as to where the vehicles came from to answer. All of a sudden, they were hit with an awful bellowing that seemed to come from above, and they all fell to the ground. That's the last thing that either of the young men remembers from the location. Many hours later, Mike said that his brother was shaking him awake. The 4 men were all in the back of the van, each suffering from a throbbing headache. Mike opened the side door. He said that as the sunlight hit him in face, he instantly felt ill. The young men looked around and realized that they were in a grocery store parking lot. People were going about their business, giving them strange looks. Mike stated that they eventually figured out that they were in Riverside, California, but they had no idea how they got there. Mike says that after this incident he and his brother have both had encounters with unknown beings, but he's unable to recall many details. I asked why he was coming forward after 18 years. Mike said that he wants answers, but has been unable to get any information. He doesn't remember the location of the monolith, almost as if it was wiped from his memory. But he and the others know it happened exactly the way it was described here.
I was told from my mother's perspective. 1989 My parents were living together in an apartment. Years before I'm born. At night, Father always slept on the wall side of the bed because my mother liked to use the lamp to read until she fell asleep. Several times a month she was woken up by my father's anxious movements at night. He would pull her face tightly into his chest and cover her with his arms. He would look wide awake when she looked to his face but was silent and did not respond to her. Every morning following a night like this she would find him already awake before her. She would see that he would always swap places with her on the bed while she slept and wait for her to wake up before leaving the bed, or if he was out of bed he would be sitting somewhere near the front door sipping coffee with his revolver tucked in his waistband. He said things were okay, so she assumed it was about night terrors or sleepwalking without questioning. Eventually time for my father to leave home to the army. Mother starts hearing the floorboards of the hallway outside of the bedroom creaking while she's up late at night reading. If she would check the front door, It was always still double locked and chained. Later phone call with my father, she brought up the noises. Father tells her that he's not surprised and explains what he heard and saw those nights, and that he was hoping he was just losing it. He was a light sleeper and explained that after the creaking woke him up at night, he would look up to the bedroom doorway, had no door, and about a fifth chance he would see a very tall silhouette wearing what looked like a long overcoat and a Homburg hat standing in the hallway facing him. Dark figure would stay for some time and then silently shuffle, sidestep, into the hallway. Father, he never slept those nights he saw or heard anything, and he was in the process of installing a bedroom door before he had to leave. Mother never stays up late in that apartment again.
I don't know if the thread is still alive, but I'm still going to share my story of the entity, which has been following me for the past decade. Picks up in the end. Be me 13 years old kid living in rural Germany. In-law family is the superstitious kind and quite often talks about the ghosts in the farmhouse. Like my dad, I never cared for ghosts and thought it was nonsense. Decided to live with mom for a period of my life, which turned out to be a mistake. For context, after the second WW buildings were hastily constructed and barely insulated. Walls were paper thin. I lived in the attic at this point. Some time later, a staircase was constructed through the room connecting the lower part of the house with the upper one. In front of the door, a hastily constructed platform with laminate flooring which creaked when stepped on. At 14 or so, I started to feel being watched while going downstairs in the night and morning. While I was gaming in the night at around 3 a.m., I heard the floorboard creaking and went instantly silent. Usually you would be able to hear someone walking up the stairs or towards the room as doors needed to be opened. This started to be the norm, and I got used to accept the being watched feeling. While I was 15, I saw a round-shaped head peeking around a doorway like in the old cartoons where they were just looking sideways. After this encounter, I've stopped going out of my room from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. After the encounter, the knocking started. On some days, not all, I heard a knocking on my door in the night. The retarded kid I was opened the door. I know, big mistake. Since I've opened the door, I felt being watched from the far corner of my room some nights, while I still heard the knocking from time to time, as well as the daily creaking of the floorboard. One evening while I was home alone, the Wi-Fi turned off. I went downstairs to turn it back on. 30 minutes later, I heard someone walking up the stairs and doing the daily night routine my mom always did. Around 3 hours later, a car pulled up to the house, and soon after my mom opened my door and told me she was back home. I've literally had any cold drained out of my face at this point and asked if she hasn't been home 3 hours before. She wasn't home at this point, and the guy she was with told me the same. I asked the neighbors if they heard the stairwell, which is quite loud and creaky, and everyone heard it. Fast forward 4 years. Everything has been as normal as it got. The creaking and the feeling of being watched never went away, but I haven't had any major encounters to this point. I've moved back to my dad's house since I had a huge fight with my mom. I haven't heard anything anymore, be it knocking, creaking, nor the feeling of being watched. In the first week, I overheard my mother-in-law talking about a bad and angry presence in the house. In the second week, I saw her cleaning the house and trying to seal it off. I asked her why she was doing this and was told ever since I moved back in she felt a presence of something. After the cleansing, she saw a tall big man, approx 6'9", with a greyish blank face. He wore a long trench coat and a hat of the Acubra type. Don't pin me on the hat. Since then there was nothing in the house, but I started to hear loud banging from the barn door which connects the house to the barn. Sometimes the dog started barking but quickly went silent and started whimpering. Fast forward a bit. I was alone this day and was doing the nightly chores of walking around the farm, closing the animal pens and the barn. On my way back through the barn, I felt being watched. Soon after, a hay bale came flying into my direction from the hayloft, landing shortly in front of me. I was properly freaked out and about to nope the fuck out when I saw something big and black in my peripheral vision moving behind some bales towards the barn door. As dumb as I could be, I followed suit and went to check for someone. It was all empty. After this I've rarely heard anything anymore.
Everyone seems to be asleep, so sorry if long. I'll post some family stories of mine, and if any anon could explain some later things, it'd be appreciated. But first, background context. With exception of me, for some reason, literally every member of my family has had a significant encounter with the paranormal, mostly good, sometimes bad. And this is without even searching for it. Been searching for something paranormal from the US to Europe for 2 to 4 years now and never had any experience with any, sadly. First one is a story my mom told me. My family comes from Haiti. It's a poor country. It's a poor state, but the people are kind and generous. They have to be, since they may mess with the wrong person. Haiti's culture is like Catholicism and voodoo living side by side. Nearly 100% of Haiti believes in God. But that same percent also believe voodoo is real. My mom grew up under Papa Doc, the dictator of Haiti put in by America. Under his reign people walked on eggshells, as people do under a dictatorship, but that didn't stop my mom's uncle at the time. He was pretty much the neighborhood drunk. Not a mean drunk either, he was a fun alcoholic, but he often came home from the bars when it was already dark out. It's less taboo today, but in 60s to 70s Haiti this was something you never did under any circumstances. This is because the night didn't belong to God but voodoo doctors. Even the dictators didn't mess with them. Some of these doctors were nice. As my mom's uncle told it, he was coming back from the bar closer at nearly 3 a.m. at night, walking through the outskirts of the capital back home. The only thing lighting his path home was the stars and moon above him. As he walked along in his drunken stupor, he bumped directly into a man so tall he seemed to be on stilts. My granduncle hadn't noticed him before somehow, as the steps of the man were silent despite the night being quiet. The man bent over and looked down at him and said, "People like you shouldn't be out at this hour. The streets don't belong to you at night." My granduncle was frozen in fear as the tall man talked. The moment the tall man finished, my granduncle sprinted home. After that he never had another drop of alcohol. Not at bars, parties, or funerals. Another side story which is more Haiti than my personal family is people coming back from the dead. Google Haitian zombie and you'll understand. People in Haiti don't embalm the dead. Too expensive, so they're buried as is quickly. When my mom was a preteen, an old voodoo doctor died. When he died, men and women started showing up in the neighborhood. Family members and friends who had been thought dead recently and sometimes decades. Once the voodoo doctor died, none of them had any recollection of their time as his workers. Their last coherent thought was watching their own funerals. Trapped inside their bodies, they watched as people held wakes over them, as the coffin was shut upon them, as they were lowered, and sometimes when there was little enough dirt. Hear their own eulogies. After that they heard dirt being moved, most likely the voodoo doctor coming to claim them, and fast forward decades for some of them, they remember waking up and walking back home. Mom said it was bizarre to see someone you buried talking to you years later. Family side time. I don't know about my dad or his family, as I don't have a good relationship with either. But my brother and my mom have a few experiences. For my mom, she's been visited by angels multiple times. When my brother was young, he had a health issue. I won't disclose what, since the procedure that solved that health issue is named after his doctor. Suffice to say, he was a child that had a body function that performed at an incredibly fast rate. Faster than humans should be able to handle. This had been going on for a couple of years at this point. One day she told me, she was at the end of her rope and was exhausted at how much my brother was suffering. So, she went to church like a good Catholic and prayed. As she prayed, An Asian man behind her tapped her on the shoulder. He said, "Do not be afraid. Your son will be all right. The doctors will check on his next visit and it will all be gone." My mom's response was to immediately grab her baby and run as fast as she could to her car and lock the door. When my mom brought my brother to his next checkup, his disease was gone. His body was functioning normally, no damage, like it never even happened. The irony now isn't lost on her that the angel spoke to her literally like an angel in the Bible does, "Do not be afraid" and all. She's had other angelic experiences as well with other family members that survived severe issues. But they're longer to type out and I'll do that tomorrow if there is interest. Onto my brother. Now my brother is a strong tall guy. Resilient sort of man, trains himself to do Spartan races and owns a dog so large it could down and kill a fully grown man easily. But even he has shivers recounting this story. One day as a teen, he had multiple long and vivid nightmares. The most notable one he remembered being one where he was chained. He woke up paralyzed, all he could move were his eyes. He looked into the corner of the room and saw something standing there in flowing robes. He said he knew instantly what it was upon seeing it. It was death staring at him from his closest. Not getting closer but just staring at him. As he began to move his body again, he shifted up and looking back at his closest and saw it was gone. A month later, he dove into a pool at the shallow end like a dummy and broke his wrist. When they did a full body scan to make sure nothing else was broken, they found a growth in him. It was cancer. Luckily, he's fine now. He's had other experiences, I'm sure. But I can never manage to get him to tell me them. Makes me wonder. I'm not lying when I say I've never had a paranormal experience. Closest I've had is paranormal adjacent. And as I type this, I realize it sounds incredibly schizo, so please stick with me. But this is the shat I need personal help with if anyone knows anything about it. Here's some context. My mom once talked to a past life psychic once. She was in a funk since everything to her seemed blah. Like watching the same movie 100 times. The psychic told her it was because this was her last go around for her soul. Everything felt tried and dull because she had already tried and done it all. Upon this, my mom said she started crying because deep down inside she realized it was true but couldn't understand why it was true. Issue is she didn't stop there. She started talking about me and my brother. I think my mom mentioned us to her. She said she had a younger son, me, that will one day grow powerful and there were powerful forces pushing me to be powerful. That my older brother would help me become powerful and that was his job. This doesn't end here for me either. I went to visit a past life psychic in California in a nice hippie town in the desert. I had my past life read and these were the cards. She said I was a young soul and most of my cards were about my current life, not my past one. She said the trust and faith card serving as my foundation and the angel card near the top means I have incredibly powerful forces pushing me. That I was leaving for travel very soon, I was going to a university in another country but hadn't told her, and that I had a karmic relationship. What the nature of it was, she said she didn't know. Could be one where me or the other person needed to fix something. Could be we just wanted another go around together. She also said Egypt was an important place to me due to the card. At the time it wasn't. Now it is. I met an Egyptian guy who was one of my closest friends. He died and I had to ID his body. Shat turned me from a boy to a harder man in a night. Couldn't get the image of his still body for years. It's only been in the time since I met my GF that I don't see his body with every waking second. I've also had an experience with weed gummies and attempting to astral project as I was high. Felt as if there were a crowd of hands pushing me up and out of my body. My mom broke down my door because she felt something was happening to me and didn't like it. Think this one is separate, but if anyone has an idea. Personally, I don't buy the chosen one bullshit or forces pushing me. I'm an atheist, but I want to believe. I'm just a regular dude, it feels. Aren't there more important or talented people than me? Why me? I don't know what to make of it, but I do know this, if it is true. When it comes to luck, I find things nearly always work out in my favor to the point it's made me lazy. I find I simply wait for things to fall into place for me rather than actually trying and struggling. I've somewhat overcome this luckily, but the luck remains the same. I've just got a depression-proof job that'll pay off my 6-figure debt in 3 to 6 years, even if I take half my salary and put it into buying the stock market. I didn't earn it or any of it. My fucking degree isn't even in the field I was hired in, and all my mom tells me is to whom much is given, much is required. Not going to lie, if I have to give back for all my luck, I may be fucked. What do you make of all of this anons? Is there something that's unique and attached to my family? Is it all a LARP? Maybe this is the wrong thread for this, but I really could use some advice beyond me being a schizo. I want to believe in the supernatural, but I don't believe in me being chosen or some shit. I'm just a lucky guy, nothing more.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.